Hey there, we're Shannon and Jerry Arner, your hosts of the Arner Adventures podcast.
We're a minimalist couple driven by intentional living and adventure.
Burned out from the 24/7 grind of running our business, we traded the hustle and the bustle for something more meaningful.
We parted ways with most of our belongings and moved to the coast.
Listen along as we chat about life's challenges, share inspiring stories of those who have taken big leaps to live a life outside of the norm,
and help you live with more intention and less physical and mental clutter.
Each episode is a step toward doing and being just a little bit better for ourselves and the world around us.
Life's an adventure after all. Join us for the ride.
It's the Arner Adventures podcast.
Hello there, I'm Shannon. I'm back for another solo episode because I'm going to introduce you to what is a absolute pinch me moment of an episode. So today's episode is really special to me because I'm replaying an interview where I was the guest, and not just any interview. I had the absolute honor of being on the Gold Digger podcast with Jenna Kutcher. Now, if you've been around here for a while, you know that Jenna is the mentor who helped me find my footing in this world of podcasting and blogging. Her program, the Podcast Lab, was the push that I needed for us to take Arner Adventures from being a blog to also being a podcast. And let me tell you, being invited to her podcast, there's no other way to say it except for it was just a pinch me moment for sure. The real reason I'm also sharing this episode isn't just because I got to chat with someone I admire. It's because we talked about something that I know so many of you struggle with: imposter syndrome, that little voice in your head that tells you you're not ready, you're not qualified, you're not good enough to do the thing that you know you're meant to do. And if you've ever felt like you were standing in your own way, then this episode is for you. Jenna and I also talk about consistency, which, spoiler alert, is the real game changer when it comes to anything in life, whether it's building a brand, chasing a dream, or just showing up for yourself every day. And you'll hear my take on consistency and how this worked for me. So if you've ever felt stuck, if you've ever doubted yourself, or if you just need a little motivation to take that step, I hope this episode is exactly what you need to hear today. So let's dive in.
One of my favorite things about teaching is getting to know my students, and Shannon feels like a close friend. Voice DMs have been exchanged when people doubt that I'm in my DMs. It's me, Shannon. Welcome to the Gold Digger podcast.
And thank you so much. And I attest to the fact that I did think someone was pranking me the first time that I ever got a DM from you. So
I'm like, it's really me. Hi, it's me here. Shannon, tell everyone about your podcast and a little bit about your journey and getting it started.
Sure. So my name is Shannon Arner. So when I started my blog, hindsight, but when I started my blog, I called it Arner Adventures. And it was based off of, and the podcast is the same way, it was based off of a big lifestyle change. So my husband and I, we had a business in the pet industry. Long story short, because it was actually an episode. It was our first episode that we talked about this, but we burn out. Really burned out. It was really bad, physically, mentally. And you just actually had a podcast about this that I was so related to someone who did this. But we, in the span of a few weeks, we sold the business. I would have given it away at that point. We sold our house, most of our belongings, and we and our dog moved to this tiny little cottage on the coast of North Carolina. And I'm going to be honest, we started the blog because it was a way to talk to people where we wanted to avoid dealing with why people were asking us, why did you do this? We got immediate traffic because it's like watching a train wreck. People thought they're crazy. They're crazy. What is happening? Let's see what's going to happen next. But it started based off of that. I truly believe everything started really catching kind of I don't want to say like a wave or trend, but it was really, people appreciated our authenticity and that we just didn't have anything to lose. It was like, yeah, we were really not well. And these are the things that we did to change our life. So the blog started with that. Yeah. So now the podcast it took us some time and we'll get to there, but the podcast now is an extension of that, where people kept saying, you really should tell your story. Yeah, we can read it in the blog, but you should tell it. And I was like, who am I? I'm going to start a podcast. Just read the blog. And I was so scared, which I can tell you more about that. But the podcast essentially now is called the Arner Adventures podcast. And it's really about our lifestyle, minimalism, living more, experiencing more while having less stuff, baggage, physical and mental clutter. And we have guests on who have made big changes in their lives as well, who have been an inspiration to us in certain ways that they quote unquote do not live the norm, which, is sort of becoming more acceptable. But there's a lot of people who make big lifestyle changes like that for various reasons. And we have them tell their stories as well.
Okay. You touched on something so awesome. And I started as a blogger too. And that was just writing was my medicine. It was easy. It was fun. I could do it at any time of day. There wasn't a lot of tech involved. And so the thought of taking that to your voice, did you have fears around that? Because I know I was like, I'm going to run out of things to say on episode 3. Like, what do I have to say?
Yeah, because I do look at people like you. So I'm an expert podcast listener. Yes. So I have my rotation of podcasts. And looking at someone like you who every week you've got content, I felt like I can definitely do that in blogs. There's enough. How am I going to talk about, us starting our garden? But surprisingly enough, starting your garden is a good thing to talk about and people appreciate it. Nice. And we just admit, gosh, let me tell you about this trial of us starting our garden. And so I feel like, yes, imposter syndrome to the max. I can hide behind something with a blog and still tell my story. But when I do it talking about it, it's just my perception of it was like so intimidating.
What's the reality? Because that perception, I think, is for everybody. Like our phone voices, our ahs, likes, like all the things. So what is the reality? What's on the other side of that?
The reality now is that it's sort of not replacing it, but it's sort of like therapy, where I do feel like now it's become such an important part of my life, but an important part of my business, which is my blog. It's no longer just this piece that, I'll do it. And it might help me in some way with the blog, but now it's just a necessity and I love it. So every week I get excited about the content we're going to put out next, or, who can I interview now? I get really excited about that. And I don't worry so much about the logistics as much as I did. Things like the podcast lab helps that a lot because the imposter syndrome stopped me. And also, how am I going to do this? Okay, even if I come up with content that I think I can talk about, how am I going to do it? And so that made it so much easier. Now I just don't have to worry about it at all.
It's funny too, because the intimidation is so real, but I tell people, I'm like, starting a podcast is easier than you think. There's technical words and things that throw people off and make them like put their hands in the air. Like, I'm out. I don't know what an aggregator is. I'm out. And a lot of those things are like a one-time thing that if you get walked through it, it's done and dusted. And then you really get to focus on the thing that you want to do, which is to get your voice out into the world. What has your audience's response been? Because reading a blog is one thing, but hearing somebody's voice and having your listeners invite you into the intimate parts of their life, whether they're driving or washing the dishes or spending time with their family, like what has that been like?
It never gets old to hear someone say, I was listening to your podcast and I just, because I know, like I walk in the mornings and I have a good hour and a half I need to fill. And so I'm listening to podcasts and I think I'm in their ears. Like, what? But the response has been so warm and just people really appreciate when you're honest and you tell your story. And I'm that way with our guests. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you for spending this time with me, telling me this story. And then I kind of forget, and then we have the listeners who are going to listen to this. But when we're telling it, even when it was not new, we'd had our blog since 2017 and then started in recent years, the podcast. And when we did, they were like, I had no idea you were going through that. And I'm like, but I blogged about it all the time, but sometimes it's a different demographic. Sometimes people have time to listen in their car or while they're walking. And sometimes they don't ever look at your blog. So it's been very warm. I think the imposter syndrome makes you think the worst situations of what are people going to say? And honestly, they don't ever think those things that you think that they're thinking. So it's been really warm, even from our launch. Like we launched with your plan, like what we need to do. We need to put these 3 podcasts in the pipeline, release them, those 3, but then just so many things you talked about with leading up to it. We did a virtual podcast launch party and people showed up online and I couldn't believe it. I was like, well, if they're showing up to this, maybe people are going to listen to it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. One thing you touched on that I think is so beautiful is the power of story. And I think that we live in such a, 15-second reel, like, looping audio type world where it's like, you can't get the full story out. Even in written form, it's really hard to do, right? It's hard to share your heart and the feelings and the tension and all these things just through words. And so I think you touched on something so beautiful of like the power of storytelling. And even when you look at culture and history, like story is this vessel that really legacy. And I think a lot of people discount the power of sharing that and sharing it in such a personal way, which podcasting allows. I just think it's really awesome.
And I'll tell you something on a personal note. It's been wonderful for our business, Arner Adventures. But on a personal note, my dad and I, not that anything's wrong with our relationship, but he just didn't talk. I didn't think he was ever having conversations with me. And every Tuesday, he listens to the episode. And he has gotten to know me more in a way that he never did because of the podcast. And so I tell people that I'm like, even if you think that one situation has helped me, it is sort of therapeutic. Then it does so many things for your business. I mean, I can talk about this forever, but just from what it can do for backlinks for your blog, it's another extension for people to find you, like the show notes, and then them clicking your website. I mean, our number one way of having revenue is monetization of our website, like our blog. And so that feeds that. It's like the number 3 source for us. Number 2 is Pinterest, which I could get into the Pinterest.
You are a good student, Shannon. What has it been like? So you hit a huge milestone. You surpassed 100 episodes. You are nearing 150. Yeah. What is the biggest thing that you've learned in terms of showing up consistently? Because you were doing it blogging, but it's a little bit different when it comes to a podcast.
I will tell you, you can ask my husband, you can ask anyone in my life. I have never been completely consistent with anything than I have this podcast. I have shown up, I should say we, because my husband does sometimes, but no, I have shown up every week, COVID, grieving, the really hardships in my life. I remember traveling and I learned this from you. It's like, just do it. So there was one time I wasn't at home and I just did it in my car with the phone. And you know what? Nobody noticed that the sound wasn't that great. Nobody noticed because they were just hearing my story. And so I have been so consistent. And so what that has taught me is that, wow, if I'm consistent and can now look back and say, okay, I always heard the statistics. Well, if you make 3 episodes, well, if you hit 7, well then, okay, if you hit 13, but then you don't hear anything past that. It's like, oh, if you show up once a week, then you'll have a good chance of surviving it. And I'm like, well, I love it. It's not surviving it, it's doing it. And so now it sort of trickles into other things of my life. Like, oh, if I do this, like my garden, if I actually go and tend to it and the consistency is there, now I have proof. Now I have something I can look at and go, I was consistent for, 150 weeks. What?
That's insane.
I mean, for me, it is.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same way. I have had mentors where I'm like, I don't want to have to commit to showing up to anything. And they're like, how many years have you been podcasting? 8. How many
800 weeks?
Done? Like, and so it gives you this ability to do the reps and to show up. And I think that is something that is very under discounted when it comes to entrepreneurship. And I think that it just helps build the muscles that you need to be consistent in other areas of your life. What would you say, Shannon, if somebody's listening to this and they are maybe even considering or like there's a teeny idea of them starting a podcast, what would you say to them?
I would say what you said in the podcast lab is you've just got to do it. Like you just do it. If I had known the things I knew and just known that just showing up is the biggest part, I would have done it 2 years before I did, maybe even more than that. But definitely I was thinking about it 2 years before I started it. And so that's the thing is just do it. Because even just the repetition and that consistency, it just becomes no big deal. I would just say, just do it. Even if you don't, it's like anything. You think everything's going to be so perfect and I need the perfect studio. I need the perfect, you don't. It's really about learning the logistics, like you said, about setting things up. And then once you have those workflows and all of those things that are just, it's just like a well-oiled machine and you just have to show up. I would say just do it.
Yes. I'll take care of all the details for all y'all. All
Yes.
I want you to do is get your voice out into the world.
Yes.
Shannon, where can everybody find out more about you? Subscribe to your podcast, tune in, give us all the places.
Yeah. So I would say the main hub, arneradventures.com. And then we're on all the regular social media platforms under Arner Adventures. But the podcast information, everything to subscribe is at arneradventures.com.
Congratulations. I
Thanks,
genuinely
Jenna.
feel like I know you. I have such a deep respect for you and the work that you've done. And just thank you so much for showing up for yourself, for showing up for your community, and for showing up for us today.
Jenna, likewise. I can't say it enough. Everything has really been learned from you. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, you are amazing.
If this episode resonated with you, or if you know of someone who would benefit from what we talked about, please share it with a friend.
It's a great way of supporting the podcast, and we really appreciate it.
Another way of supporting the pod is by leaving us a 5-star review or rating on the platform you are listening to us on.
And go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That also supports us. You can always find us, the show notes, and sponsors who support the podcast at arneradventures.com.
And until next time, enjoy the journey you're on. We're wishing you lots of adventures.
Bye-bye.